Welcome back to another week of Alchemy Online. This week we're going to be taking a look at how we use screen printing techniques to adhere graphics to our shop decks. Now there are a ton of different ways that you can take art that you've done, art that exists in the world, and put it on a skateboard. Today we're going to be specifically looking at screen printing to put our classic Alchemy logo onto some of our shop decks. If you're at home and you're making a single board for yourself, we really recommend stencils are an ideal and cost-effective way to add graphics to boards. If you haven't seen it, we did an episode a while back that details some of the process of stencil making, but today we have about 22 boards that we're gonna be printing on, and so stenciling is way more work than we want to use. So we're gonna dive in and look at all the tools and tips to screen print graphics onto your skateboard. So before we start actually printing, we're going to take a quick look at the tools that we use in this process. We use a traditional squeegee, which has a urethane edge here that we use to push the ink through the screen. We've got our Speedball water-based ink because we like our planet and we don't want to kill it. Some classic painter's tape, an extra speedy clamp, and then our rig here is a single color rig, which means we can just do one color at a time, and it's basically a hinged system with a magnet so we can lift our screen. Our platen has been modified to print skateboards. Essentially, we have a center line, and then I have marked 2 bolts here so that we can put our skateboards in the same place every time. And then we have our screen. So before we get into things, it's important to mention that the majority of produced skateboards out there on the market use heat transfers to put their graphics on. This is a great method for high numbers and full graphics. That means nose to tail, lots of color. Heat transfers are going to be the way to go. Since we are a small operation with small, simple graphics, we like doing it by hand, and we're going to be using our classic Alchemy screen, modifying it just a little bit so that it prints nice on our deck, and we're going to be doing about 22 boards today, and we're going to number and sign each one of them, and then they'll be available for people to buy, skate, and destroy. So the very first thing we're going to do here to get this ready to print is we're going to use our painter's tape, and we're actually going to block out the word Alchemy and boarding so that we have a nice centered graphic that just says Skate Tacoma. This is, again, a silk screen. Essentially the way it works is we have very thin fibers of silk that are woven together, basically creating a grid. Now there's a ton of different screens out there. The higher the screen count, the more detail you're gonna get. Essentially, I think about it like pixels or a bit rate. The fewer mesh lines you have, the bigger or blockier your image is gonna come through. The finer those little holes are, you're gonna get a lot more detail, a lot more rounded surfaces, shading, things like that. So we're gonna go ahead again and use our painter's tape to just block out the areas we don't want the ink to come through on our screen. And we're gonna go ahead and tape it from the back side so that as I'm printing, my squeegee's not gonna pull up any of that tape on us. Now that we've got our screen all taped, it has a very inspiring message of the best place you could possibly skate. We're gonna go ahead and get our screen loaded up. We're gonna be putting the screen in sideways because we want a vertical graphic on our board. Let's run in this direction. And you'll notice I've got several shims in here. Because we're printing on skateboards, it's really important that we maintain a small degree of separation between the screen and the thing we're printing on. It's called off contact. So I can adjust the spacing to whatever it needs to be with these thin little shims. Sweet. I love it when it works the right way the first time. So sometimes you eyeball it and you get it perfect and you don't have to do any adjustments. Now that our system is all set up, we've got our board registration right where we need it to be. So every time we put a new skateboard in, we're gonna get the print in the same area. We've adjusted for our clamp, everything's ready to go. So before we actually print, the first step is getting ink on our screen and flooding our screen. It's a really important step of the process. We'll explain why. Essentially right now, our screen's completely dry, and so there's all those tiny little holes that we're gonna be pushing this ink through to transfer our image. We do not want to have to rely on the squeegee to push the ink into the screen and then transfer. So a simple flood stroke, we don't need a lot of pressure at all. We're gonna take our squeegee and just gently pull it across the screen. And what this has done now is it has loaded all of those tiny holes in between the mesh with our ink. So when we're actually printing, all we're doing is transferring our ink from the preloaded screen onto the deck below. Every time we print, when we lift the screen, we give it another flood stroke so that it's ready. It also prevents our screen from drying out. Because this is a water-based ink, if we left this unattended for too long, the ink would actually dry in the screen. There are chemicals and solvents to help get it out of there, but sometimes if you wait too long and leave your ink in, you can potentially ruin that screen. So always flood your screen. So after we gone ahead and we added some extra shim material to the bottom of our screen, giving us the proper clearance for our off contact, our screen is no longer pulling up that ink and we're getting nice, clean, uniform prints. So now we just have to do it 21 more times. So what can happen, and what often does as you're printing, is you might experience some blowout that we mentioned before. And essentially, that's getting ink where we don't want ink. And what happens a lot of times is we get too much ink buildup pushing through the screen. It comes through on the bottom side and it starts transferring onto our board. So one of the easiest ways to go about fixing that, instead of rinsing the whole screen out and starting over from scratch, we're gonna load up a board, pretending we're gonna print as usual. And before we actually go ahead and print a blown out image on the skateboard, we're actually gonna just take some scrap paper. We're gonna lay it down and we're gonna do an extra hard print on this. So hopefully that extra ink that's built up on the underside of our screen is gonna transfer onto our paper, kind of restoring us back to our natural state that we can keep printing from there. So we've gone ahead and we got our run all printed, and now we're gonna talk a little bit about finishing steps, because this ink has to dry and we like to put an additional layer of clear coat over it to help that graphic last a little bit longer as you're beating it up out in the streets. So let's grab one of these guys and we'll take a look. All of these decks are still wet to the touch. I could definitely completely smear it, so make sure you have a nice spot you can set things aside to dry. If you're printing on garments, you're gonna wanna absolutely heat set this ink so that it's ingrained into the fabric that you're printing on. For our skateboards though, we're gonna let them air dry about 24 hours so that they are dry to the touch. And again, we're gonna come in with a polyurethane in a can, and we're gonna give it 1 to 3 layers of clear coat so that we're sealing that graphic in. It's gonna result in more smudges than chipping. No one likes a graphic that flakes out. So that's how we finish our boards in-house. You can definitely run these under a heat gun, a hair dryer if you need to. There's all kinds of heating equipment out there for industrial screen printing, but again, we're gonna let them air dry, put a little clear coat on it, and then since these are small batches and they're hand done, we're gonna go in after the fact and number them 1 through 22 and date them so we know when we produce this graphic. And they're really fun when they surface years later. Someone will bring in a beat up board and I can look at the number, figure out when it's from. So that's gonna be a wrap for this week's board printing.